Hello, everybody. Welcome to this book launch with Carcanet Press. And I am not Carcanet Press. I am Ian from the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. And we're delighted to be launching a brand new Anthony Burgess book. It's a momentous occasion, and what a sizable book it is. You can see the book cover, but there's lots more behind that. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you all. So yes, we're here to do a book launch. This is a celebratory business. I am not the person to be waffling on about this book, because we have three very esteemed panelists for you today. We have Jonathan Mann, who is the co-editor, co-founder of the Journal of Impact Cultures and curator of Capital Letters live poetry series, and also the editor of collected poems, and what a job that would have been. We're also, alongside Jonathan Mann, we will be joined by Rachel Mann, no relation, and she is an Anglican priest and a writer, and she was poet in residence at Manchester Cathedral. And also we'll be joined by Andrew Biswell, also no relation, although that should be a little bit more evident, who is the author of A Real Life of Anthony Burgess, and is general editor of the Irwell edition of the works of Anthony Burgess. So we shall invite them in fairly shortly. Let me tell you how all this is going to work. The event will last about an hour. And I'll hand over in a sec, and there'll be some discussion between Andrew and Jonathan about the process of editing such a weighty tome. We'll then hand over to Rachel, who will be reading some of the works in the book, and then we'll open it out to a general conversation between our erstwhile panelists, and at some point we will then switch to the audience Q&A. A few Zoom tips and tricks. I'm sure many of you have been to many book launches, but not all of you maybe. We can't see you, so I could be talking to anybody right now. I'm sure you all look fine, but we can't see you. We have your cameras and microphones turned off. How the Q&A is going to work is at any point during the event, it could be 5 minutes in, it could be half an hour in, you can send a question, and you should see, particularly if you're on desktop Zoom, there should be a Q&A function. So just press the Q&A thing will pop up, and then you can just type a question, and it means that you don't have to keep it in your head. As soon as you think of a question, just ping it through. They will all come through to me. Then when we get to the Q&A later on in the event, I will be your voice asking questions to the panelists. So do get those questions in. Bear in mind, I think on mobile, if you're on mobile Zoom, some of the functions might be more difficult to access. And then also we have the chat box as well, which is separate to the Q&A. And the chat box really is there for you to, if you just want to make trivial comments about Burgess, that's fine. If you've got technical issues that you can't solve, then pop those in. And if you address those to all panelists and all attendees, then maybe someone else can also answer as well. We're all here to help each other out. It's the equivalent of sitting in an audience and kind of whispering to the person next to you. Well, we can do that now. It's like silent heckling. It's wonderful, and it doesn't put our panelists off. So that's good. And then finally, during Rachel's reading, whenever Rachel's reading from the book, I'm going to put up the text of the reading on the screen. So you'll end up with two things: a text and a picture of Rachel reading. What you can do is, if you'd rather see more text and less Rachel, that seems offensive, but if you want to do that and read along, that's fine. or the other way around. You can actually move. You should be able to slide across and resize the images to your preference. That is entirely in your control. I would say also that on the PDF we are missing the end of one of the poems. You'll notice when that happens because it'll stop scrolling. Sorry about that. We just missed off a bit, but it's fine. You'll still see and hear it. I think that is everything. I've already sent into chat a special discount because you're wonderful people and deserve money off the book if you want to buy the book. Also, tomorrow you'll get an email from Carcanet with the discount code and a link to buy the book. If that doesn't come through to your email tomorrow, then just get in touch with Carcanet. I need to stop waffling. I'm going to bring in our panelists. I'm going to bring in Jonathan Mann, and there he is, and there's Andrew Biswell. I shall disappear. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Jonathan. I should explain that I'm speaking to you from the reading room of the Burgess Foundation, and behind me, slightly out of focus, are Burgess's books from his working library, including his rhyming dictionaries and his poetry books, out of which this new book partly emerged. I should say this is the third Burgess book that's been published by Carcanet. I mean, plundering the shelves here, I found the Revolutionary Sonnets, which was the first Carcanet volume to appear, followed by The Ink Trade, a selection of Burgess's essays, and now, magnificently, the collected poems, 500 pages, edited by Jonathan. Jonathan, I think many readers will be surprised by, not just by the volume, though that's impressive in itself, but by the range and variety of the work that's here. So, I mean, I think not everyone will have read the book. Maybe by way of introduction, you could walk us through some of the contents and talk about how different much of this work is.
Okay, well, thank you. The book's organised into a variety of sections that are intended to sort of represent the types of poems we see. So it starts with some quite long poems, an essay on censorship, elegy for X. These are fairly long form poems, but you'll also see epic poetry in there. So it moves from those longer form poems to Moses, which is a very substantial poem written in the epic form. So we're going to see some epic poetry, and that takes up a lot of the book. And then there's other sequences, longer sequences, such as Revolutionary Sonnets, which we've just seen from Kevin Jackson's edition. And then there's new sequences, or a new version of Belly's Blasphemous Bible, which is a translation of Giuseppe Belli. And then there are some occasional poems that have never been published before, some very personal poems written by Burgess, some sonnets written by Burgess. You'll also see words for music. So there's a very good selection of fairly lyrical pieces that were intended to be produced for voice and music. So it's quite a range there.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is that there's a lot of, as it were, verse letters. There's the quite famous letter to Vladimir Nabokov on his 70th birthday. I probably mangled his name. I'm not a Russian speaker, alas. But also among the new work, the previously unpublished work, you found a number of letters in verse, of sonnets normally, that Burgess writes to various people who'd written to him, I think out of the blue, not friends, asking him to do various things. Maybe you could tell us something about those. Yeah,
well, I think it's worth reflecting on the idea of a professional writer responding to members of the public, or sometimes professors in university, people who we may have had a fleeting friendship with or professional relationship with. But he took the time to write some very carefully written sonnets, which must have taken quite a lot of time and effort and a lot of planning. So we see some descriptions of why he can't go to Yale. there's a sonnet to Peter Bruhl, why you can't go there on a particular day, or there's advice to a Mrs. Fisher who's asking advice about being a writer. We're going to hear that later when Rachel closes the session with it. There's sonnets just written, and I think what these represent is a remarkable generosity in amongst all the work that he was undertaking on a daily basis, writing music, writing essays, writing novels, and writing large amounts of poetry. He went to quite a lot of generous pain to write to people using the sonnet form. I think he was enjoying the game of writing in sonnet form. I think he enjoyed the sense of productivity that provided, and I think he enjoyed the economy that it delivered. But it must have taken him a long time to write these things, and a lot of time away from his other endeavours.
I like very much the sonnet he writes to somebody who'd written asking for a photograph, and he writes back saying, "I'm too ugly to be photographed," refusing to send a photograph, but he sends a sonnet instead. And we think didn't even keep a copy of that poem, because some of the work you found through manuscript dealers and so forth. I wonder if you could tell us something about your research journey, the various places you visited to assemble this collection.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's two main archives I've drawn on, and one is where you are right now, that very same place. In fact, it's worth pointing out that the books behind you are a real treasure trove of Burgess notes and Burgess inserts and doodlings and annotations on fly leaves of books, and all manner of random collections of paper were to be found in those very books. So there's translations of Catullus, for example, that came from a dictionary behind you. There are occasional verses. There was a verse written to Lynn Burgess. She was all brittle crystal. That was to be found in amongst these books. Some of those, because of the time when I was researching, some of those were just emerging, and they were really, really recent discoveries. Now they're happily in the catalogue. So there were a lot of surprises that came out of the unpacking of Burgess's library. Also held in the foundation in Manchester is an awful lot of manuscripts, typescript material, handwritten material, notebooks, photocopies. So I had the wonderful opportunity of raiding all that and engaging with that material and transcribing it. And it was a very labor-intensive process transcribing these pieces. They're very sort of visceral on the page. They're messy. They're not always easy to read. They're not easy to work with. They're not always in a sort of predictable shape. But they're very, very wonderful artifacts, and it was just wonderful sifting through them. So a lot of the material came from the archive where you're sat right now. Another swathe of material came from the Harry Ransom archive in the University of Texas in Austin, and they hold letters and manuscripts and typescripts and again notebooks, and it's quite a wide range of materials that I was able to access there too. And again, some manual typing went on there, quite a lot of hammering out of this stuff. So this brings those collections together, and I think it's the first substantial Burgess collection, certainly of poetry, to bring all that together. Other archives were used, so things that didn't go into the book, but I went to the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford to look at verse plays there, and also there's a very good archive in Banbury for the local press. I was investigating Burgess in the local press in the 50s, so that was there as well. So hopefully that gives you some insight.
Thank you very much. Well, I know it's taken you 18 years, and congratulations on having come to the end of that research and typing and proofreading journey. It's time now to hear some of the work, and here to read it is Rachel Mann. She'll be well known to many of the Carcanet people. Her poetry collection, A Kingdom of Love, was highly commended for the 2020 Forward Prizes. She's also edited Christina Rossetti's new selected poems for Carcanet, and her first novel, The Gospel of Eve, was published in October this year. Welcome, Rachel, and thank you very much for agreeing to read some of these Burgess poems.
Thank you, Andrew. I think given the time, I'm just going to crack on. So the first two poems, brace of poems, are taken from Burgess's translation of Belly's blasphemous Bible. Two moments of creation, shall we say. 1. The creation of the world. One day the bakers, God and Son, set to and baked, to show their master's skill, this loaf the world, though the odd imbecile swears it's a melon. And the thing just grew. They made a sun, a moon, a green and blue atlas, chucked stars like money from a till, set birds high, beasts low, fishes lower still, planted their plants and said, aye, that'll do. No, wait. The old man baked 2 bits of bread called folk. I quite forgot to mention it. So he could shout, don't bite that round, ripe, red pie filling there. Of course, the buggers bit. Though mad at them, he turned on us instead and said, posterity, you're in the shit. "44. The Annunciation. You know the day, the month, even the year. While Mary ate her noonday plate of soup, the angel Gabriel, like a heaven-hurled hoop, was bowling towards her through the atmosphere. She watched him crash the window without fear and enter through the hole in one swift swoop. A lily in his fist, his wings adroop. Ave, he said, and after that, Maria. Rejoice, because the Lord's eternal love has made you pregnant, not by orthodox methods, of course. The Pentecostal dove came when you slept and nested in your box. A hen, she blushed, for I know nothing of. The angel nodded, knowing she meant cocks. Our next reading is an excerpt from O Lord, O Ford, God Help Us, also you. And please do take note of the Stedman cartoon which accompanied the publication of this poem in the New York Times on the 29th of December 1974. And I think we felt this was a lovely thing to read an excerpt from, given that we are in a point of transition from one US administration to another. O Lord, O Ford, God help us, also you. A New Year's message for 1975. Unhouse that calendar. Her dates are done. Her whoring's over. Get another one. Try to pretend that a new year has begun. The diary blank apes sinlessness. This is the most pathetic of all fallacies. The spring's eternal hope of a fresh start in the core of winter, of down under, heart of summer. The same season, after all, both lack the sharp elan of spring or fall, so very and oppressively much here. The church is realistic. Its new year does not begin until Easter. New Year's Day is part of Christmas time, roughly halfway, marked by the circumcision, snip and bless and bow half-heartedly to cleanliness. But we, who groan from drink, or showering, sing, believe the 1st of January can bring regeneration magically about, both in our psyches and the world without. On January the 6th, 10th, in other words, a bit later, we vow, get down to it. Nonsense. It can't be done. That's definite. Spring brings the true new. Nature's statements are simple enough. All the change is circular. The firm, ascending, straight, progressive line is dream geography, that's all. In fine, this 1975 will see us still churning in 74's satanic mill. Has any 12-month fed us more with fear? Was ever a more salutary year? At least we're learning and no more pretend that history moves to a Hegelian end. Utopia spells error on. The earth's resources are not infinite. A birth's another burden in a hungry world. Man's gobbed up the soil and also hurled his poisons in the water and the air. Hell is a fact and no mere Sunday scare. America as Eden's dead and gone. The devil rides, and so on and on. Men we thought big are now revealed as little, conniving and contriving, mean and brittle, power-hungry merely, greedier than us, vindictive, vulgarians and ugly too. Truth's beauty and the antithesis is true. I gawped at New York television while your Ford, unflawed by an ironic smile, announced to the whole world, truth is a glue. Oh Lord, oh Ford, God help us, also you. Half a millennium has gone by since great Niccolo penned precepts for a prince. But in those great unregenerate days, at least a prince, however hard he played the beast, saw statues hovering over him and read Plato and Aristotle. The huge dead were still alive. But now, alas, it looks as if the drug heads, nothing man in books, infects the castles where our rulers sit. History, that other Ford once said, is shit. The men that British rotten boroughs sent to hector in a venal parliament fulfilled no democratic precepts, yet saw that their own mean times were soundly set in an unfolding swathe of destiny. Man was and had been and would always be what Homer, Seneca, Thucydides, Xenophon, Cicero and more like these had limed. They saw their legislative task as somehow philosophical, would ask, as Jefferson and Lincoln once did, the one sound question: what is man? What must be done by government, man's servant, to fulfil the deeper longing of his higher will? For politics was metaphysics, art, eloquence, knowledge of the human heart that is now sunk into a disrepute. Shameful and shameless, all too absolute. I'm very conscious that time is zipping on. I'll aim for 2 more poems. I'm going to read the second of the 5 revolutionary sonnets which were produced within the novels Inside Mr. Enderby and Enderby Outside. 2. Bells broke in the long Sunday, a dressing gown day. The childless couple basked in the central heat. The papers came on time. The enormous meat flowered in the oven. On deep carpets lay thin panther kittens locked in clawless play. Bodies were firm, their hair clean and their feet uncalloused. All their wine was new and sweet. Recorders unaccompanied crooned away, coiled on the roof tree, bored, inspired, their snake crowed in Black Monday. A collar kissed the throat, clothes braced the body, a benignant ache lit up a tooth. The papers had a note. That act may mean an empire is at stake. Sunday and this were equally remote. And finally, excuse me, a poem which was written in response to the lunar landings. Imagination is your true Apollo. Imagination is your true Apollo. In our translunar skills, the moon's small beer. Facts, fancies cripple. Acts are dim to follow. Words. Small cheese, I meant. Small green cheese. We're too long beyond the moon. The moon's too near. Bored with the merely visible, SF spends trillions on each fresh galactic race, yet shells out not 1 cent to make us deaf to the shrill signals from that silver face, attuning us to tunes from deeper space. Still, it was all romance drawn up from wells, or myth, an uncertain lantern in the air, or Prester John's balloon, the Christian hell's chill annex, or the huntress in her chair. Now Armstrong, Neil, and Aldrin Ed are there, and Collins in his clucking mothercraft. Old glory on the consecrated crust is all the old glory that alas is left. Glory in your progressive lust, these heroes who sift silver for its dust. Where the black gods deliciously prevail, you find cool tribes. Our hot entropic plan submits to seeing human order fail, erects inhuman order where it can, and smiles and sighs at lunonautic man. So at this point, I'd like to invite Jonathan and Andrew to turn their cameras on, and I believe that we're going to spend a little time conversing. Although I hope, friends, you'll just allow me to take a little moment's breath and a glass of something.
Thank you for that reading, Rachel. That was very revelatory in all sorts of ways. Jonathan, it seems to me that what we've heard is quite formal poetry in many ways, or poetry that's very interested in form. And yet it also seems to me that Burgess is quite experimental in his fiction, even to some extent in his music. And I wonder if it's possible to reconcile these things. Why was he so attracted, do you think, to these particular forms, to sonnets and to heroic couplets, whereas in many ways the novels seem much more kind of relaxed? Did you arrive at any conclusions in that while you were editing the book?
I think Burgess is responding to tradition. I think what we've just heard are some examples of the way that Burgess is engaging in dialogue with the modernists mainly. I think the type of form that has been adopted, we can see it in the poetry of William Empson. We can see it in the poetry of W.H. Auden and in Ezra Pound, who took fairly familiar forms, fairly traditional forms, and wrapped into it more contemporaneous technological concepts, some imagery that was sometimes unusual. We've just heard the technological imagery of moon landings and so forth. And Burgess's choice of formal method was, I think, his way of containing and measuring those changes and measuring the state of modernity or the state of modernism. And he was very informed by T.S. Eliot's version of ancient and modern being jammed together. So I think the more expansive forms that we've just heard, the tighter forms, are very representative of a literary tradition that he responds to directly, and that's a literary tradition from the 30s, which he then imports strangely into the 70s, very much against the grain, very much against the fashion. So he's exploring those forms later than his precursors.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me bring you in here because I know that you've read quite a lot of Burgess's fiction, but I don't know how much of the poetry was familiar to you before now. And what do you make of it? What do you make of this sort of this very baggy book with the variety of different forms and styles?
I mean, this feels like an initiation, actually. This book. I mean, I was aware of the range, the the extent of Burgess's poetry, but I can't say it's something that that I've spent much time with. And I have to say, I'm one of the things that's really come home to me, and I think it, particularly in that reading just then, is the formal control that's on offer here. I mean, I'm conscious that some of this writing does feature in the context of novels, and I think that there's something about Burgess's sort of naughtiness, his sort of desire to go to the edge of blasphemy and sometimes beyond, that is about the kind of postmodern mashup of forms here. But actually, when we take this poetry out of that context, we're in, I think, as Jonathan's indicated, we are in the realm of Auden, particularly in those revolutionary sonnets, and actually in O Lord, O Ford, which is sort of brave in its political boldness, but actually has these echoes of Pound. I mean, I was hearing Pound's Hugh Selwyn Mobley, you know, all that stuff, the section about the civilization, the bitch gone in the teeth and all, and the sort of rotten civilization, and I'm just fascinated by the way in which he as someone who's quite transgressive wants to be drawn back and held by the tradition. I mean, this even is reflected in those translations of Belly, which it's great delight as a vicar to read naughty poems about the Bible, it has to be said. But of course, they're Petrarchan sonnets and very disciplined pieces of work. And the use of the Volta in the 9th line is just, I mean, they are translations, but it's so beautifully judged. I love it. Just extraordinary.
I mean, Jonathan, do you think that sonnet is where Burgess is most at home? We spoke earlier about his kind of letter sonnets, and obviously he's translating sonnets, but there are a number of his own as well.
I think for Burgess, the sonnet was a matter of discipline. I think he enjoyed the formal discipline, and I think he enjoyed the idea of writing outrageously experimental language, experimental imagery into such a tight form. I think the sonnet form is one of the forms that he's at home with, but the longer form, we've just heard poems from around 1973, 1974, and 1975, which for Burgess was a high point of flourishing of his exploration of heroic couplets and blank verse. And he wrote Moses, and he wrote a long poem called Augustine and Pelagius, and he wrote large amounts of the poems for Napoleon Symphony around that time. So it's interesting for me that he was most productive in that epic form, and he, in my view, he was most comfortable in these larger pieces, such as Burn later in his career, which is in Ottawa Rima. these very large, expansive forms.
Could you say something about Burn? That's the novel in verse, which it's still in print, so it's not in this book. But I mean, briefly, if you can, could you try to sum it up? This the last thing he published, the book that appeared posthumously, in fact.
I think I might struggle to sum it up in about 5 minutes, but the poem is a testing, in my view, a testing of the form. Burgess uses Ottavarima, which is a very technical, disciplined form, and he uses it to describe nothing less than the history of the European project and why we shouldn't all be speaking Latin, and what poetry is and how it works, and to describe some sort of potted history of the 20th century and where it's going. His use there tests the form to its very limits, so that suddenly the form collapses in the middle, which is a very big surprise, but it becomes about form, and it gets so compact and complicated that the form itself seems to become recursive and seems to exist within itself somehow. So I think that particular piece, which as I say in the introduction to this edition, arguably should be included as a really satisfying long poem. It really is the ultimate technical test, especially for a man who at the time was also coming towards the end of his life.
Yeah. I'm conscious that time is very short, so I'm going to try and collapse my next question, or to divide it two ways. First of all, Jonathan, how seriously did Burgess take his poetry? And Rachel, if you could, how seriously should we take his poetry? I don't know who wants to go first with that.
I feel like I should give Jonathan the last word. My instinct is to say, very seriously, actually. I think that whether it might be argued that he is bringing forward into the 70s, for example, forms which have lost their traction, I think that there is a fascination to be found here in, and I think this is something which, Andrew, you've picked up on, something and you've written, this thing in Graves, Robert Graves, poetry is a wild Pentecostal speaking with tongues. And I think that what's exciting about Burgess's poetry is that he takes that Pentecostal wildness, but recognises that form is telling. Form tells us what is possible and is available. And I think at a time when I think contemporary poets genuinely need to start wrestling with form again, seriously, this feels very contemporary to me.
Thank you. Jonathan.
So your question was, how seriously did Burgess take his poetry?
Yeah.
I think the first answer to that, which sounds like a pithy answer, is he took it serious enough to dedicate so much time and energy to writing it, to writing very substantial pieces, which took humongous amounts of discipline and effort and planning and experimentalism and all that. He was also taking it serious enough to he says in his autobiography, he sent his poems to T.S. Eliot, and he says he received a mild note of no thank you, apparently, but it was also, he also took it serious enough to submit it into competitions, and he won a competition in his local community in the 1950s in Banbury, and he was also taking it serious enough to tackle very serious subjects. So the notion of censorship, the role of literature, the role of poetry, and he used it, as you can see in the edition, extensively to explore the biblical story, to explore theology. He used it as a means of examining very complicated concepts and philosophical inquiry. So yeah, I think he took it very seriously. I could have just said very quickly.
Yeah, Well, I mean, certainly there's evidence that he was writing a poem every day in the 70s when he was working on translating the Belly sonnets. The manuscripts are dated, and there is one a day for a period of some months, actually. Now, we've been talking a lot about form, and there's an opportunity now, if the technology works, to see Burgess reciting, not one of his poems, but a poem by Keats, which he had by memory. It's a very short clip of him doing that from a film made in Rome in the 1970s. Here we go.
When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grains, and when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their colors with the magic hand of chance, and when I think, fair creature of an hour, that I may never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, and on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Keats would go to sleep listening to the music of the fountain of Bernini. But nobody can hear that music now.
Well, thank you, Burgess. At this point, Ian is going to join us again to field questions from the audience. Welcome, Ian.
Hello, welcome back, everybody. Yeah, this won't be quite as dramatic as Burgess in the Rain in the Spanish steps of Rome. I guess we start with Peter's question. Very simple. Why now?
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah.
It could have been in 10 years' time. It could have been in 20 years' time. This is an ongoing process. I can tell you that the publication now, certainly for me, is part of just a negotiation with myself as to when to finish, because there is more that can always be done. One of the difficulties of collecting Burgess's poetry is that it just keeps appearing, and it just keeps, it's almost as if death has not stopped him. And I'm very certain that within 1 to 2 years, more poems will be found. But it's needed, I feel from a scholarly perspective, it's needed because, as I think Rachel alluded to earlier, seeing it in its own shape, in its own right, is a very different experience to reading it in context of the novels. So I would say that's really my primary driver. That's why I did this in the first place. I actually needed to do it myself for research purposes. I needed to study the poetry as poetry. So for me, this began in about 1999, copying out poems from novels so that I could read them in their own right.
I think that answers half of Eve's question of were poems discarded. But the second half of that question is why? How do you choose?
It's a really difficult choice. But the majority that were not included are ones that seem to actually serve the purpose of a novel or serve some form of dramatic purpose and don't seem to perform as poems in their own right. There might be a plot device where Burgess has described, for example, the process of creation in Enderby, and it just features overuse of the word something and the words like plonk. These wouldn't be very good things to read in their own right. Items such as Napoleon's Symphony and Burn were not included for more copyright publication technical reasons than anything else. There's a whole swathe of verse plays that should be read as well very soon, but they are apparently due for publication in another edition. So there's quite a few reasons, and it was very tough to decide what goes in and what doesn't go in. And in fact, some of the material in there, there's a long poem from One Hand Clapping that did go in there, because even though it's a parodic form that echoes some of the excesses of the period, it seems so accomplished that it would be wrong to not include it, even though it seems to be intended in a very parodic form and intended fairly comically.
I know that there was a lot of material that didn't quite make it. For example, unfinished work. I mean, poems that he began and couldn't finish for one reason or another. And also, I think some of the song material you decided to leave out as well because it was so obviously attached to its music. Is that right?
Yeah, there are some song lyrics that did that, yeah, which didn't really perform very well on the page because Burgess said that the song lyric was also very tied to music. So some of the lyrics are very just syllabic exercises, really, and some of them were just very, very repetitive. A repetitive word just included. Again, it would make for not the most pleasant of reads, not the most evolved of reads. Maybe
a job for another editor.
Yeah.
You mentioned Enderby, and Kevin asked about the Mask of Enderby in Burgess's writing. Let me read this question full from Rob. Burgess was exasperated by a critic who asked whether the poems written by Enderby were meant to be any good. An abdication of the critic's duty, he called it. But there's a point, isn't there? How far are the Enderby poems the authentic voice of Anthony Burgess? And how far are they the voice of the character? I guess that's a more general question to the panel.
Well, the history of this, for anyone who doesn't know, is that Burgess, when he was a student, he published a number of poems under, not as Anthony Burgess, but as John B. Wilson, which is his original name. And then many years later, in the 60s, some of those poems come back within the frame of his fictions as Enderby poems. But I think Jonathan can correct me, he was also writing new work for Enderby around the same time. The poems were voiced by Enderby or his muse. So there's a kind of contested authorship between what's Burgess and what's Enderby.
Yeah, I would very much agree. And it's also worth pointing out that much of the material that appears even in Enderby Outside, the second novel, was written quite a long time before the novel. So sometimes it seems as though the job of the novel is to somehow conserve or preserve what was already produced, and that is then given to Enderby. I do think this is something that we will hopefully be arguing about for many years. Actually, I think there's a lot a lot of debates that can be had here about the authorship and ownership. Also, it's the case for other novels as well. So in Vision of Battlements, that's the case. The verse is given over to another author. In other novels from the mid-50s as well. And the long poem I was describing earlier is supposedly written by a Dylan Thomas-like poem called Redvers Glass. And it's in a very parodic form, like I say. So some of these things are composed for the characters, but they had to be composed. And when you take them out of the novels and put them together, you can see how carefully constructed these pieces were, and how much effort and care Burgess had put into writing the poems, which to me also suggests more serious intent. even if the poems in the novels were not necessarily there in their own terms, if you see what I mean.
A few of our questions are about influences. Christian writes, what about Belly's influence? Angie may want to give some context on that. This constant tension between blasphemy and salvation, sounds a bit like being a vicar, seems to me to be very Bellian.
Well, I'd be really interested to have Rachel's perspective on this.
I mean, in one sense, and I suspect this is a very obvious point, one of the things that happens when we think about regulation and rule is that there's a line which is there to be crossed. I mean, it's just inevitable that blasphemy is a shadow of restraint, of holiness. I think that tension is something which and is very clearly discerned in my favourite Burgess novel, Earthly Powers, that negotiation of the line of what is wicked and what is permissible. Blasphemy, I mean, it's generally seen as something to do with words, of course, a sort of a transgression. And again, I want to come back to how one of the things that, I mean, it's clearly fascinating for Burgess in Belly's work, but I think is a general abiding theme for him as a kind of lapsed Roman Catholic, is that sense of what is it possible and permissible to say? What is sayable? And at what point do you actually generate something quite holy by being vulgar and crass and naughty? And I think that's part of the joy of reading Burgess, is that in a sense he's holier than a lot of holy men because he gets that line.
Yeah, and we're back to serious again, the seriousness. I think you wouldn't go to those lengths to write what Burgess calls the Belly's blasphemous Bible. And it's very good that Jonathan's given that title back to those poems, because the title too was suppressed. Faber, who first published the poems, were terrified that Mary Whitehouse was going to chase them through the courts. And so that the book is called ABBA, ABBA.
James writes, I'm interested to know the influence of Gerard Manley Hopkins on Burgess's poetic style, used in the Clockwork Testament, for example, the wreck of the Deutschland.
It's everywhere. It's detectable everywhere. It operates on nothing short of the decision of which words to use and in which combination. We were listening earlier to the imagination is your true Apollo, but before that we were also listening to O Lord, O Ford, and for example, a single word that is used in there very conspicuously is unhousing, which is taken from Hopkins's The Habit of Perfection, which features a phrase, and you unhouse and house the Lord. So very, on the edge of blasphemy, I think, in a sense there. And Burgess began his literary career in a very tentative way as someone emulating Hopkins. So he wrote in a school magazine in the style of Hopkins. That was his first poem, and Hopkins permeates into his prose as well. So there's a wonderful description in A Clockwork Orange of Alex enjoying music, and that's littered with Hopkinsian devices and Hopkinsian language. So I think the quick answer to all that is Hopkins is everywhere. You can hear it in the linguistic fireworks, the jamming together of strange words, I think.
And this might need to be a 30-second answer. Thinking slightly more modern, John asks, was Burgess engaged by his poet contemporaries?
I think some of them, yes. Paul Muldoon, Seamus Heaney, he reviewed, but on the whole, he avoided not reading. He avoided reviewing poetry because he felt more at home writing about fiction and non-fiction, I think.
Thank you very much. We are getting towards the end of the event, I'm afraid to say. I think what we're going to do is say a big thank you to our panelists. Are there any last things that you wanted to get in to say about the collection before we send you on your way?
There's too much to say. We've done our best.
I have 2 words.
Oh.
Buy it.
Very good. Very good. The bookseller in me appreciates that.
The editor in me as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for, we're going to end with one final poem, but I want to say while you're all still here, thanks everybody for coming to the event. Don't go away. We have one more poem to come. But thank you, and thanks Carcanet for your partnership with the Burgess Foundation, and it's a privilege to be involved with your last event of the year. And do check Carcanet's various feeds for future events as well. So I think what we'll do is I shall sadly shoo away Andrew and Jonathan. Thank you both for your invaluable inputs. And as I slowly, while I slow you to turn you off, I think we'll we'll leave it with Rachel reading the final piece. Over to you, Rachel. I'll be back at the end of this reading.
Thank you, Ian. This is just a simply terrific poem. I wish I'd paid heed to it in my younger days. It's called Advice to Would-Be Writers. Simple. Don't. Advice to would-be writers. Simple. Don't. Advice to would-be writers. Simple. Don't. Any profession's preferable to this. Exhilarating, true, the muse's kiss, but inspiration's accolades just won't pay rent. Buy groceries. To grieve, to groan, to search for the mot juste, to aim, to miss the scene or image sought, to brave the hiss of critics, feel in bowel, brain and bone, torment and terror. This, my friend, is writing. Then add to all the public's crass neglect and fellow authors' sneering and backbiting. This and much more the tyro must expect. To launch a book, you'd think, would be exciting, but ship and builder are too quickly wrecked. Neglect and poverty have rocks in wait to wreck us. Writers in general are a wretched sect.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks for joining us, and thank you. It's now just down to me to say thank you to everybody. I'm going to pop the link to buy the book and for you to get your special discount as well. And again, there'll be an email tomorrow with that on. So thank you all for coming. That is the end of the event. What's going to happen now is I'm going to turn my screen off. There will be blackness and you can all kind of secretly walk away. But the chat section will be open for another couple of minutes in case you just want to chat or have any final questions. But thank you very much for coming, and an early Merry Christmas.